Hey guys, today I wanted to share the Ruby Mountain handmade watercolors that recently arrived. So these were purchased a little while ago. They arrived in a bubble wrap mailer, and I'll make sure to have all the information you need, where you can buy them, how much they cost, and show notes down in the description below. So I've been talking about a lot of different handmade watercolors recently, from the Black Sheep Art Supply watercolors to Beam Paints to Letter Sparrow watercolors. We've really been exploring handmade watercolor options that you can use at home. I'm really looking forward to sharing this Ruby Mountain review with you guys today, and I hope you guys will enjoy it. So to start off, I want to go ahead and do our unboxing, or unbagging if you will. So it arrived in a bubble wrap mailer. It does seem to be a plastic bubble wrap mailer, and down at the bottom, if you look closely, it does say carbon offset shipping. Etsy offsets 100% of the carbon emissions from your delivery. That sounds nice. I don't know how true that is. Now, the bag itself is from ecobubbleMailers.com, and it says reuse me for exchanges or returns, or recycle me at grocery bag drop-offs or wherever plastic bags are accepted, etc., etc., etc. So one of my concerns, and it's not a big concern, but it is a concern, is that when it comes to plastic recycling in the US, we are often told that things are more recyclable than they actually are. So I would like to see more businesses use compostable packaging when mailing out orders, when feasible. So that's not a big deal, but it is something I am becoming increasingly more aware and more concerned about. But inside, we have a receipt and some paperwork, which I'll show you guys in a minute, and a small stamped bag that says Ruby Mountain Paint Co. on it. So inside my package, I do have a receipt from Ruby Mountain Paint Company, which I really appreciate. It says when it was ordered, which was May 16th, so it's been almost a month. When it was scheduled to ship by, which was May 20th, and I think I received it a few days after that. It also talks about how much I paid for these. So this is the Fresh Air Travelers palette, a handmade watercolor palette in a new tin. It was $45 with tax. It was an additional $4.25, and then shipping was $6.72 for a grand total of $49.25. And as I've mentioned in some of my other handmade watercolor videos, handmade watercolors are not always the most economical option for watercolor artists, but they are a great way to support a fellow small business and to help somebody earn a living. So while this is not an option for everyone, it is a bit of a luxury. It's a really cool luxury, and it's not as big a luxury as some folks might think. They also included a note from the shop, which I'll read to you guys. I am choosing not to show it because it does have my address on it. So they say, thank you for your order. I feel so lucky to make watercolors and art supplies that inspire you to create. Thank you for supporting my small business. If you like your purchase, please take a moment to leave a review. It really helps my shop grow and reach other artists. Thank you again for your order and happy painting. And then Kate also wrote a handwritten note. Thank you, Rebecca. I hope you love this new set. Heart, Kate. And I really do appreciate when businesses include a receipt. That is super helpful for me as someone who reviews art supplies. And I appreciate when they leave a handwritten note, because we are supporting small businesses, and it's really nice to kind of have that connection. They also included a nice postcard that shows the paint being milled, as well as instructions for how to care for our paints, how to care for your handmade paints. Thank you for supporting my small business. I truly appreciate your purchase. I love to see what you create with your paints. Tag your art with hashtag Ruby Mountain Artist so I can see and share your art. Let's inspire each other to create more beauty in this world. Caring for your handmade watercolors. Add a drop of water to each color before you start painting to ready it for use. Some colors take longer to soften than others. Ideally, let the pans of paint dry completely before closing your tin. Because these paints are made with natural materials, they can soften and re-moisten depending on the humidity of the environment. In humid climates, store your set with the lid slightly open to allow for optimal airflow. Cracks in the paint do not affect the quality of the pigment, and cracked pans can be used just like regular ones. If you find your paint comes out of the pan, simply add a drop of water to the pan and set the paint back in. It will re-wet and stick to the pan again. Although these watercolors are non-toxic, do not ingest or use on skin. Keep small pans out of reach of children and pets. Questions about your paint? I'm happy to help. Email me at katechuala@yahoo.com. So as a Louisiana artist who definitely deals with humid painting conditions, I do appreciate these instructions. I'm aware of all this, but I do appreciate Kate taking the time to educate artists who might not be as familiar with watercolors or might not be as familiar with handmade watercolors. This allows artists to get the best use out of the product, so that is as fair as can be possible. We also received a business card. Ruby Mountain Paint Company, Handmade Watercolors and Supplies for Artists, Kate Chuala, paint maker and artist, Ruby Mountain Paint Co., katechuala@yahoo.com. And a very cute holographic sticker. So that's all the extras that came with our little watercolor palette. A while back, I ordered the Ruby Mountain Paint Company's Pigment Salt Sprinkle samples. These are very similar to Brusho, and I was really curious about how they'd compare, and I'd never gotten around to doing an unboxing swatch, so I figured I'll lump these in with today's palette review. So it'll be a little bit of a two-parter, and they also included a sample of a new color. Well, new at the time, so this would be Italian Yellow. I'm going to swatch this at the same time I swatch the Fresh Air palette. So this is going to be a two-part review. And with the Pigment Salt Sprinkles, they also included some instructions on how to use them, which I'll go over once we're actually swatching those. For today's unbox and swatch, I am going to be using the Bao Hong Academy watercolor paper. This is an inexpensive cotton rag paper that you can order from AliExpress. I am not recommending it. I am not recommending it. It is a perfectly fine paper and very serviceable for field tests and for unboxing swatches. So that's why I'm using it. But before we can get to swatching, we do need to unbaggen our little palette. And this is such a teeny palette. It's about the same size as the Letter Sparrow palette. It is in a small metal tin, about the size of a small Altoids tin, and it has a vinyl Ruby Mountain Paint Company sticker on it. So for comparison, here is my Letter Sparrow set, and I'll link the review for this in the description below. You guys can see they are about the same size. So inside our little metal tin, we have a swatch of watercolor paper that's held on with a small magnet. That's very similar to the Letter Sparrow. We have some crumpled up paper to keep our paint safe. We have some crumpled up tin foil to keep our paint safe. And then we have our individual mini pans. And these are in makeup tins. So the back has the name of the color on it, and they are held in place by small magnetic strips. And this looks so familiar to what we saw with the Letter Sparrow. Let me grab those and we'll compare the two again. So here is the Letter Sparrow set. It also has a paint map with a magnet on the back. She actually filled this out, so this came like this. It also has watercolor half pans with a magnet on the back to hold them in the palette, and with their names written on the back as well. So pretty similar there. I guess there's not a whole lot new under this old sun. Now, one of my complaints already, and I know, already complaining, gosh, Becca, is this just wasn't packed tight enough. Everything really shifted in transit. And for $45, I would have liked to see more paint. This is not a whole lot of paint here. This is even less than what we saw with the Letter Sparrow. Let me grab that one more time. And so you guys can see these are like almost half the size of the Letter Sparrow half pan. Well, these aren't half pans. These hold about half of what a half pan will hold. So you guys can imagine how little paint these actually hold. So that's the Ruby Mountain on the top and the Letter Sparrow on the bottom. And these got all out of whack in transit. So if you guys look on the site, the Fresh Air palette that they have listed there actually comes with kind of a wooden spacer, and it looks really cool. So I think I was hoping this would be like that. Unfortunately, it's not, and we're just gonna have to deal with it. But the one on the site is really, really cool, and I really would have loved to receive that one, but that's okay. So the colors in the set, let me go ahead and remove all these half pans. So we have black currant, we have rosewood, we have saffron, we have pistachio, we have turquoise, we have lavender blue, we have clay, and we have earth. And Ruby Mountain promises that all pigments are non-toxic, but just from what I'm seeing here, it looks like we have maybe a Venetian red, a yellow ochre, a sap green, an ultramaroon, a burnt umber, and maybe one of these is a burnt sienna. Ruby Mountain Watercolors specialize in small batch artisanal watercolors that use pigments sourced from around the world. Their paints are non-toxic and are poured into whole pans, half pans, or even bottle caps. Here though, we see that these are actually makeup half pans or makeup pans. They promise high quality paint and art supplies for all types of artists. Each color is made from pure artist grade pigments and their own natural binder formula, which includes gum arabic, honey, and clove oil. So these would not be vegan watercolors if that's something you're interested in, because they do use honey. So some of the things I noticed while we were kind of going through this is that these are really, really small, and you really are not getting a lot of paint for your money. And if you are an artist, a watercolor artist who would like to use handmade watercolors in your day-to-day art, perhaps a better value would be the Black Sheep Art Supply watercolors, which I reviewed a while back. Of course, artists have a lot of different reasons for buying handmade watercolors. I know that economy is not always the #1 reason, but I did feel like I needed to point that out because those do use traditional half pans and they would work well in a traditional palette, whereas these are going to be a bit harder to fit into your traditional palette. I'm also already noticing that these are a little bit hard to get water onto. This palette at this particular size, it's just a little bit tight. It was the same problem I had with the Letter Sparrow watercolors. Also, this teensy tiny paint map, it's going to be kind of hard to get a swatch in there. I think this will just about fit though. So I believe this is black currant. And I'm actually not a fan of when watercolors are given a cute commercial name. It just kind of makes it harder, in my opinion, to use. So this, I think, yeah, that's like a Venetian red or an Indian red. So this is going to be true, like a actual Indian red. And the paper included, that might be hot press watercolor paper, but it handles more like a Bristol, which is kind of a problem because it doesn't give a really accurate reflection of some of the colors or how some of these paints might handle. There's like no color with this at all. What is that about? Maybe it's just on that paper. Fortunately, I am going to swatch these on actual watercolor paper so that I can actually tell what's what. Yeah, that doesn't really handle like watercolor paper at all. So I do want to point out that this is the Traveler's palette. It includes 2 additional colors from the standard Fresh Air palette that's listed on the site, the one that has the wooden insert. So you get 8 colors in this rather than 6 colors for this. I cannot necessarily find this listed on the main website, so I probably bought this from her Etsy. And one of my complaints is I can't find the pigment information. I'm going to keep digging. I want to get the pigment information for you guys, but I feel like this is a reoccurring concern time and time again when I review handmade watercolors, is that I feel like there's just not enough information provided with my purchase, and I would always like more information than what I actually get, and then I have to dig for it. Which for me, as an art nerd, somebody who's really into watercolor, I want all the information I can get. I understand why they might not want to share their proprietary information. I'm not asking for ratios, but it would be helpful to be able to share that pigment information with you guys. So also, this is a bit on me. Their names are all written on the back, so I didn't bother to write the names down because I figured I'd be able to find them on the website. And they do have the names on the website for the smaller palette that has 6 colors and the larger palettes that have all the colors. And something I really would have appreciated would just be an insert that actually had the palette, these color names written out, or if the color names had been written on the color map, because now they're all wet, they're gonna be sticky, they're gonna be hard to remove, and I can't tell you guys which colors are which. So part of that is on me, but it would also be really helpful if Ruby Mountain Paint Company had included an insert about this particular palette. Time for some actual swatching though. We're going to be swatching on a cold press cotton rag watercolor paper. I hope it will bring out the best that these watercolors have to offer and will be a more fair and accurate palette than the paint map here. So I will admit I do judge handmade watercolors on a slightly different scale than what I judge professionally, or I guess I should say mass-produced watercolors on. I do tend to be a bit more lenient since this is someone's livelihood and they don't necessarily have access to the heavy machinery or to the pigments that a mass production company might be able to offer. But there's some things that I'm definitely looking for when I'm swatching handmade watercolors. So I'm looking for ease of activation, which some of these colors already seem like they might have failed. I'm looking at opacity. You do want some opacity with some colors, but I am not looking for gouache here. I didn't buy gouache here, so I don't want opacity from all the colors, nor do I necessarily want the same opacity from all these colors. I'm also looking for muddiness. How much do they muddy the water? How dirty does the water become as I'm working? Because that can be a good indication of the inclusion of optical brighteners or other additives that might stretch the watercolors out. I'm looking at granulation. Some colors should granulate, some should not. I don't want everything to be milled exactly the same. That would be a bit boring and we'd lose a lot of what makes watercolor such a fun medium. And then after the watercolors dry, I'm looking at liftability. So I am going to swatch our 8 colors here for you guys. The 2 black stripes are going to help me determine how much opacity are in these colors. It gives us something to kind of work with. And I'm going to do a mass tone swatch, and I'm also going to do a blended out wash swatch. And Ruby Mountain Paint Company promises creaminess with their watercolors. I don't know if that is supposed to mean opacity, or if it just means that they are quick and easy to activate and that they lay down consistent fields of color. We will just have to determine that as we're swatching. I will say though, if you like to use larger brushes, if you like to paint big, this little travel palette is not going to be the right fit for you. It is a little bit difficult to get into these pans as is. Now, these are mineral pigments, as I mentioned earlier. I was not really able to find the pigment information. I will keep digging as this review progresses. So hopefully I can find it for you guys. But I could make some very educated guesses as to most of the colors in this set. And I could probably make some educated guesses as to which pigments are being used. As you can see, if you're painting quick, pollution might be a problem. And everything's kind of packed in there, so it's not like I could have rearranged these colors too much better. And these were pre-activated earlier. It's only been a couple minutes since I did the map up there. So any stubbornness of color just should not be happening, especially if she's using honey as part of the binder. Honey's a humectant, it loves water, so these should activate really readily. Here's the color that was so stubborn before. Here's hoping this one's a little bit better. Not really. It is a pretty color though. It's just, it doesn't have any impact. It doesn't really have any oomph to it. I don't know if it's the pigment used or the mineral used or if it's the granulation. It sort of looks like it might be a malachite. And this one looks like it might be a green earth. And they are muddying the water quite a bit. That's not super surprising since the first 4 colors were all kind of opaque. This, I would bet, is an ultramarine blue. I would be surprised if lapis lazuli was the base. It would not surprise me if it went with PB29. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of oomph to it either, unfortunately. And then I think this one is clay, I believe. Yeah, not really getting much. So when it comes to activation, these are not really great. And I went with this particular palette because I could see myself being able to mix colors that I would use, colors that I would enjoy with this palette. And I thought this would be an easy one for a field test. I'm not necessarily that confident anymore. So we have several colors that don't really have a whole lot of color going on. There's not a lot of saturation, and they were kind of difficult to activate. So that's kind of a shame. So I am going to give these a chance to dry, and then we'll revisit them and see if the colors have shifted any, if we've gotten any more granulation, anything like that. So everything has had a chance to dry. You guys can see the granulation. Most of these are pretty granulating, and most of these colors are pretty stubborn about not wanting to activate or are difficult to activate, including black currant, turquoise, and clay. The water muddied quickly, and many of the colors seem somewhat opaque, and maybe this is what she meant by creamy. While I definitely think these traits can have a place in the paint box of many artists, for a watercolor comic artist like myself, these traits tend to result in muddy paintings. And pigment info doesn't seem to be available for these colors under the individual color listings, which is a common practice with handmade watercolors. So unfortunately, I can't share the pigment info with you guys today. So next, I want to attempt a little bit of color mixing. I don't really have enough room on here for that, so I'm going to get myself a fresh sheet of watercolor paper. But before I remove this sheet of watercolor paper from its block confines, I'm going to go ahead and do the lift test. So this is the same brush I applied the colors with. They've had about 40 minutes to dry. It is a humid night, but they seem like they might be very lifting. Kind of remind me a bit of the Jasper Stardust watercolors in terms of opacity, muddiness, granulation, liftability. So I feel like these might not really be the watercolors for me. You guys can see how many of these colors are lifting and how easily they lift. They lift really cleanly. So there's not a whole lot of staining or granulation going on with these colors. So for our color mixing, I want to do an 8x8 grid. And since these have had kind of a chance to dry out, I'll go ahead and reapply some water to them. So I'm going to start by applying a stripe of each color, ideally at mass tone or almost mass tone, going vertically. And it needs to be wide enough to accommodate all 7 other colors. So I'll just continue that from top to bottom. I also want to go ahead and point out that this set was purchased out of pocket. I have no affiliation with Ruby Mountain Paint Company. They did not contact me and ask me to do this review. This was purchased of my own volition. All opinions are my own. I'm also trying to be as fair as possible. And those of you who've watched some of my professional paint reviews know I can get a little harsh in those. I'm trying to be a little bit more gentle here since I think handmade watercolors have a lot of really interesting properties that aren't necessarily found in mass-produced watercolors. So I don't hold them to the same standard, nor do I have the same expectations of them. That said, I do also feel like I owe it to you guys to be as honest as possible with my opinions, since $45 for this amount of paint is a lot of money, and I want to make sure you find paints that are going to make you happy and allow you to paint the kind of art, whether it's comics like I do or illustration or fine art, that allow you to paint the kind of art that you want to paint. And different artists have different needs, which is why I think it's important to share my experiences as a watercolor comic artist with you guys, so that I can add that experience to the voices that are already out here on YouTube talking about watercolors. So if you enjoy reviews like this one, if you like what I do and you'd like to help me continue to do it, it would mean a lot to me if you did a few different things. I'd really love it if you hit like on this video, only if you liked it, of course. I'd really appreciate it if you shared this video with your other friends or anyone else you know who enjoys watercolor or is into watercolor. And it'd really mean a lot to me if you want to support this work in a more long-term fashion, if you would join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. So I'm going to give these a chance to dry. They are a little bit staggery, a little bit off kilter. That's okay. It's a bit like myself. And while those dry, I'm going to go ahead and attempt to do a little bit of manual color mixing. So we're going to grab our yellow ochre. We're going to grab rosewood, which is kind of like a dark reddish color. I don't think I'm going to really be able to paint any oranges with this set, because we just don't have anything that really would help us create that. We would need more of a true yellow or a true red to really get some nice oranges. But what we are going to be able to get with the Fresh Air palette is we are probably going to be able to get some really beautiful muted tones. So I'm going to try next to create a green from ultramarine and yellow ochre. And as I saw with, I want to say the Letter Sparrow palette, but it might have been the Beam palette that I reviewed. You can get some really nice colors from an ultramarine and a yellow ochre, but you can't really get a good green. This is nice. This is like a nice green gold, but it's not the kind of green I was looking for. And then the other two greens in this set are not really the kind of greens I'm looking for either. So that is this color here, which I believe is pistachio, mixed with the ultramarine blue color, which they call Fresh Air. So let's try taking some of pistachio and mixing it with this kind of Indian red color, and we'll see what we get. We're gonna get a lot of browns from this palette, mostly because everything in this palette is already kind of muted, is already kind of neutral, if not outright neutral. I think the only colors that are not just outright neutral are the ultramarine blue, which would be Fresh Air, and maybe this turquoise, but this turquoise is such a light color. There's just not a lot of power to it, not a lot of oomph. So it does make mixing colors a bit more challenging. I don't necessarily know that I would call this a mixing palette, although we can get some pretty colors. Like that's a pretty color there. It might just take a bit more practice. And then let's see what we get when we mix clay with this one up here. Not a whole lot. There's just not much power to that color. So you can see when I talk about activation, why activation is important. If we can't pick up any color, or there's just not much power to that color, it makes mixing colors with it, and it just makes using it in general more of a challenge. So these mixes here haven't entirely dried. There's still some wet colors, but you guys can see that as they're drying, they fell out of solution. So you have a lot of milky, muted, sort of whitish super granulation going on, but no real color mixes, which could be really frustrating if you bought this palette and didn't realize that this might happen. So while some of these are pretty interesting to look at, and we do have some pretty mixes, it is annoying that you just can't really consistently mix those colors. But maybe we can do some optical color mixing. And this is when we layer two colors on top of each other, hence the grid. And this will allow us to see if maybe we can get some color mixes going on this way. So one of my frustrations with the fact that these don't really activate readily is that in order to get enough of the color on here, I have to glaze over it a couple times, which, as you guys can see, created a lot of color pollution. So I'm going to try to pick up a good amount of color and really get it mixed onto the brush so that we can get a better idea for how these glaze. But these don't really strike me as glaze friendly watercolors. Now, I want to point out, this doesn't make them bad. Different artists handle their paints in different ways. But it does mean that if you paint like I do, if you have a similar art style to mine, in that you do illustration art, you paint a lot of really small faces, you do a lot of layering, a lot of glazing, these are not really going to be a good fit for you, and I can't really recommend them to you. I think my three biggest problems with these watercolors are they really struggle to activate. I don't really know why. I can literally see my brush making indents in the color, but I'm just not picking up hardly any color at all. They are very prone to lifting, so that means if you do glaze a color on top of another cup of an existing color, there's a high probability that it's going to lift back up and kind of pollute both colors, so you won't be able to get a really clean glaze. And then the granulation kind of means you can't really mix the colors you might want either. So we're left with a challenge. We're left with a conundrum of how to get what you want from a limited palette when glazing is not a good option and you can't really mix the colors you want either. Now, I would not recommend necessarily buying more colors. That's not a solution I prefer to recommend. In general, I want to see the ability to mix a variety of colors from just 6 colors. You know, Daniel Smith sort of set the bar for me with that, with their Essential 6 set, and I haven't really looked back. I don't know. All I can really say is, as of right now, I'm not really loving the Ruby Mountain Paint Company's Fresh Air palette, but that's just one opinion. That's just one artist demonstrating how she would use these paints, and I still want to put them through the Natto Soup Studio field test to see if maybe I change my mind, or maybe with a little bit of practice and a little bit of handling, I can actually find a lot of reasons to love these paints. So that's going to be in a different video, a different installment. I hope you guys will consider subscribing, hanging around, and checking that video out when it's live. Okay, so we have unboxed and swatched the Fresh Air palette. Now I want to take a look at the Pigment Salt Sprinkles. And for best results, I'm going to follow their instructions. How to use the Pigment Salt Sprinkles. These watercolor crystal salt mixtures can be used in a variety of different ways depending on the desired outcome. 1. Dip a dry brush into the Pigment Salt Sprinkle and tap lightly over wet paper, or sprinkle on dry paper and spritz with water. 2. Scoop a little pigment salt onto a folded scrap of paper and tap onto the desired area of your work. 3. Dissolve some pigment salt sprinkle in a palette well with a little bit of water and use it like paint or ink. 4. Try it on light washes and dark washes. So longtime fans of the channel know that I love me some Brusho. So this is my Brusho. I keep it in salt containers with a little bit of rice in the bottom just to absorb some of the extra humidity in the air and to keep it from clumping up on me. This is a trick I learned growing up in Southeast Louisiana, where people used to keep rice in their salt shakers for the same reason. And to my knowledge, Brusho is actually very quiet about their formulation, but to my knowledge, these are dye-based watercolor and they are in a powdered form, and when you sprinkle them into water or you spritz them with water, the colors just kind of explode. Each one of these tends to have 4 or 5 different colors in the bottle. I can demonstrate that for you guys. I figure the Pigment Salt Sprinkle is like that, but maybe just utilizing pigments rather than dyes. So maybe it would be a little bit more light fast, because being dye-based, Brusho has some quirks. Brusho can be a little bit of a challenge to use, and while I love it, it would be nice to have some other alternatives and to be able to support a small business. So these are samples. I did pay for these samples, but they are sample amounts. This is Dark Winter Nights and this is Sunburst. And I purchased the 2 samples that seem to have the most variety in the pigments included. And from here, I can already see there's probably a little bit of mica powder in Sunburst. And there might be a little bit in Dark Winter Nights as well, but not as much as Sunburst. Sunburst has kind of a pearlescent look to the plastic. So generally when I'm using Brusho, I'm working on a cellulose inexpensive paper. It works just fine. For today's demonstration, I'm going to use Fluid 100 cotton rag paper. Should work just as well. Usually I actually use it on Fluid Easy Block. And my preferred method of using Brusho is to go ahead and put a wash of clean water all over it and then sprinkle it in. One of the downsides to Brusho is it can be really messy, and once it gets in your studio, it's gonna get everywhere in your studio. Unfortunately for me, my camera does not like white paper. So what I'm gonna do instead is I'm gonna spritz the paper. This is just clean water. I'm not really trying to saturate it, and just trying to get a fair amount of water onto the paper. And I'll pick a few different colors and show you guys what I mean. So it has this like really neat kind of firework effect. And I have a lot of really old videos where I kind of explore Brusho and the potential it has for an artist like myself. I used to use it all the time when doing convention watercolors. And one of the things I like most about it, and you'll see that really with the black, is how each color has several different colors in it. So with turquoise, you have some green, you have a lot of blue, you have some yellow. With red, you have a few different reds in here. You have some cooler reds, some warmer reds. With this lightish blue color up here, you have some light blues, you have some dark blues. With the black is really cool because you have some like dark gray, but you also have some blue and some red in it, and even some yellow sometimes. So it's actually a lot like embers. And then with the brown, you get some red, you get some orange, you get some brown, and maybe even some black. And there are a lot of Brusho colors, and I don't own all of them, but I own a lot of them. And anyway, if you're interested in learning more about Brusho or some potential uses for Brusho, I've got a lot of videos on that in the channel. I'll link them in the description below. But I encourage you to play with it. It's inexpensive, it's fun. The only problem is it does have a tendency to get out of control and to get all over the place. So that was a quick demonstration of Brusho. That's what I'm going to compare the pigment salts to. I'm gonna try to move it without merging all the colors. And I'm gonna grab a fresh watercolor block. This is also 100% cotton. It is also cold press. It's just a different brand. And I'm going to take the first suggestion because it's one I've never done before myself, and I'm actually going to use a couple of clean watercolor brushes to just kind of sprinkle the pigment on the paper. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to spritz the paper with some water. And I know that is really difficult to see. And I'm going to start with Dark Winter Nights. These little plastic bags are a bit of a challenge to get into, but not too bad. Dip in there, dip off some of my excess. I didn't want to dip off all mine, just wanted to dip off the excess. Oh, okay, that's pretty. And it is a lot like Brusho. So one thing I noticed about Brusho is that Brusho has kind of a sweet smell, almost like Kool-Aid. And yes, I did actually smell my brush a little bit just now, and I will probably be sneezing purple for a week. Next is Sunburst. Yeah, this one definitely has mica in it. I like that though. I think it adds a little something extra that Brusho was kind of missing. And from what I remember, it didn't say which of these had mica in it, which didn't. So for my next test, I'm going to go ahead and just sprinkle it onto the paper. Of course, you want to clean your brushes off after, or you could use makeup brushes to apply it to your paper. And then I'm going to spritz it with water and see what we get. So yeah, much like Brusho, we do get multiple colors in a pack. It does say that it is Pigment Salt Sprinkle, so I assume they're using some salt to help keep it in its kind of dry, powdery form. And with Sunburst, we actually got some mica in it, which is going to give it a little bit of a pearlescent effect. But other than, you know, maybe a little bit more color variety, I don't really see how these are all that different from Brusho, but we'll definitely be able to tell because one of the problems with Brusho is that it does reactivate with water, and you do have to brush off the excess because it can really get out of control. So after I've allowed these two to dry overnight, I'm gonna try to reactivate them and see how much movement I can get out of them. So while these are drying, I did a little bit of digging on the Ruby Mountain website, and the pigment salt sprinkles are not easily accessible from the site itself. It's not like I could go to a drop-down menu and find them, but Googling pigment salt sprinkles brought me back to the Ruby Mountain site where these were listed. So I don't know if these are still live. It doesn't say sold out. Maybe she just hid them from public view. I don't really know. But basically, I had assumed that these were mineral based, but looking at the site, she actually uses a manufactured pigment powder that's dye based. And this is mentioned in the Andromeda mixture that I linked in the description below. And comparing the color swatches, these are really similar to what Brusho already has to offer. Maybe not an exact dupe, but really close. There's some fun, more unique mixes like Sunburst has mica, Forest Floor has a really nice color gamut, and Andromeda seems to use gold powder, but the base colors are really similar to what Brusho already has to offer. So if you are considering the Pigment Salt Sprinkles and you're on a budget, what I would go ahead and recommend is I would recommend you get the Brusho. They're going to be a little bit cheaper. And then for the more unique mixes, you get the Pigment Salt Sprinkles, particularly if you're looking for some mica, if you're looking for some gold. Brusho doesn't natively have that. You could add that to Brusho if you wanted to, or you could get it in a pre-mixed convenient form from Ruby Mountain Paint Company. So since the Pigment Salt Sprinkles are a dye-based watercolor powder, I'm going to go ahead and assume that they're going to have a lot of the same properties that Brusho has. So while we're going to check back in after these have already dried, I don't really expect a whole lot of difference between the two options, and it wouldn't surprise me if they're using the same base dye powder. So these have had a chance to dry fully overnight. At the top is the Brusho, at the bottom is the Pigment Salt Sprinkle. They seem pretty dang similar to each other. I really think the only difference might be the mica shimmer that was added into Sunburst. The same is not added into Dark Winter Night, so it's really not that dissimilar from some of the purples that Brusho has to offer. So up here is the Brusho. As you guys can see, when you add a lot of water, too much water to Brusho, you lose a lot of that like really nice diffused color. It all just kind of blends out. Brusho does say that you can add Brusho to water and then paint with it really similarly, or really similar to the Pigment Salt Sprinkle. To me, that's kind of a waste. There are better watercolors for that. You could do it in a pinch, but where I think both of these shine is when you're either sprinkling them into not a puddle of water, but slightly damp or damp paper, or when you're spritzing them with water to get those diffusions. So with Brusho, I would recommend using a brush. You can use a drafting brush like this one. You could probably use a makeup brush and brushing off the excess pigment, because not all the pigment is activated, and if you hit it with water again, it's going to activate further. And everything I just said is probably true for the Pigment Salt Sprinkle as well. We have the diffuse color. Areas where we've hit it with too much water, you tend to lose a lot of what makes it really exciting and fun. Those different colors that are kind of mixed in. Both of them are fine. The Pigment Salt Sprinkle might be a little bit expensive, especially because she is purchasing an existing dye powder and repackaging it. I know it's a different formulation. She's mixing different colors together, but I do think it's a little bit expensive compared to the hand milled watercolors that she has on offer. So these don't seem to be available on her shop or on her Etsy anymore. They're all marked sold out. So maybe this was something that wasn't intended to be a long-term project, or maybe it's something that didn't really pan out. Honestly, I feel a little bit ridiculous mentioning it, but I did have it in my stash. It is made by Ruby Mountain Paint Company, and I had intended to review it, so might as well throw it in with the rest of it. So before I finish up with these dye-based watercolor powders, I'm going to demonstrate how they reactivate with a little spritz of water. So this is why you want to make sure you actually brush off any excess, because if you're going to paint on top of it, you're going to run into reactivation issues. And for some reason, even though there is water in here, it doesn't want to spray. So I'm just going to flick some water on to show you. So areas like this are probably not going to reactivate, but anywhere you see the pigment really kind of building up, it's going to be a reactivation problem. I'm so sorry I'm struggling with this so much. I don't even know why. Anyway, as you can, might as well just hit it like that. So you can see it does reactivate it does redissolve. So one of the tricks I used to do when I was doing a bunch of convention watercolors is that I would use the Brusho for backgrounds, and then I would brush off the excess as best as possible, and then I would apply a layer of water to the character, particularly the character's face, and try to dab up as much loose wet dye as possible. And part of the reason I did that was once you've added water to this, it basically sets it after it's dried. It's not going to reactivate a whole lot. It also tells you exactly what colors you're dealing with in that area. So if you need adjust the colors, if you need to adjust your mixes, then you can do that when you're painting. And it also means no surprises. You're not going to have any loose powder suddenly reactivating and polluting or pulling into your existing watercolor illustration. I have a bunch of videos where I show you guys how I use Brusho to do watercolor commissions, watercolor portraits. The same thing would probably be true for the Pigment Salt Sprinkle, so I'll link those down in the description below. Alright guys, so I pre-activated my little sample of Italian Yellow. I received this sample way back when I purchased the pigment salts, and I actually really like the card it came on. It's a sturdy card, it has the color name, and it also says where it comes from, so in case you really like the color, it's very easy to order more of it. All I did was I dripped a little bit of water onto it and gave it a chance to kind of soak in. And I'm going to swatch it at the end here of the palette. So I wanted to talk to you guys about the pros and cons that I had with the Ruby Mountain Paint Company Fresh Air palette. Now, this is a smaller travel palette in a smaller tin. So let's start with the pros. Ruby Mountain Paint Company is a small business, and it's really nice to be able to support small businesses, especially during the pandemic. A lot of small businesses are really suffering right now, and it's nice that small businesses that have an online front, at least some small businesses that have an online front, are able to survive right now. These watercolors are handmade in small batches, so if you enjoy supporting a fellow artist and artisan, that's also really cool. They use non-toxic paints, which if you're a parent, a pet owner, or someone who is concerned about your health, that might be something that's really beneficial to you. That might be something that you really appreciate, especially when you consider that as watercolor artists, we do pour a lot of pigment down the drain, whether it's in the wash cup or when cleaning our palettes. So it's nice not dumping toxic pigments into the water supply. It's also really nice to support more ethical consumption. There's less plastic, there's less waste, everything is a bit more recyclable than the mass-produced watercolors typically offer. So what about the cons? Well, at least in the set I purchased, and that was the Fresh Air palette, the colors are a bit too muddy and milky for my taste. I found the colors reluctant to activate and challenging to mix. And with the Fresh Air palette, particularly the travel palette that I'd purchased, you really don't get a lot of paint for your $45. So what's my verdict for the Ruby Mountain Paint Company Fresh Air Travel Palette? This one back here. Well, these have different properties from some of the other handmade watercolors that I've reviewed recently, and are a bit like the Jasper Stardust watercolors I reviewed a while back, but they do behave a bit better than those. While these are not really for me, there are tons of positive reviews for Ruby Mountain Paints online, and you might find that they're a good fit for you. So I know that's kind of a wishy-washy sort of verdict. I guess the closest verdict I can give is if you are a watercolor comic artist, if you paint watercolor illustrations in the same sort of style that I do, if you do a lot of layers, if you do a lot of glazes, these paints are probably not going to be the paints you're looking for. Now, there are lots of great handmade watercolors on the market. There's something for every taste. So if you're interested in supporting small business and you want to buy handmade watercolors, I am sure they're the right ones for you out there. So I hope you guys found this helpful, useful, and informative. If you enjoy and use Ruby Mountain paints, if you have a different opinion, if you want to share some insight or some input, I would love to hear from you guys down in the comments below. Well, Well, y'all, I really enjoyed reviewing the Ruby Mountain Paints Fresh Air palette. While it's not really the best fit for me, I am sure there are artists out there who absolutely love it. If you are looking for other handmade watercolors, I reviewed several recently, and I hope you guys will check those reviews out. So recently, I have reviewed the Letter Sparrow Primaries palette. So you guys saw this earlier in the video. These are also handmade watercolors. These are vegan watercolors, and they also utilize a magnetic palette. They are very similar in many regards to the Ruby Mountain watercolors that you guys see here. Now, I like these a little bit better because the colors are a little bit brighter. It's a little bit easier for me to mix what I want, but I had some similar concerns about the two palettes. The fact that both palettes are very small, you don't get a whole lot of paint in them, they're fairly expensive, and it's kind of difficult to get a brush in there, are all challenges that I found frustrating. I did recently review the Black Sheep Art Supplies. I think this is their basic palette. It's a 6-color palette, but I've been buying some of their colors open stock. So I have a few more than 6. And I actually really like these. I hope you guys will check this review out. It is a small business run by 2 people, and they're really hoping to change the face of art supplies, which I think is fantastic. And you actually get a full half pan of paint in here. So I am all about that. I have also recently reviewed the Beam paints. I think this is their primary set of 6 as well. I really enjoyed these, and I think you get a fair amount of paint with these as well. These are a bit more expensive, but there's a lot of care and thought and love putting into Beam paints that I think many people who are looking to avoid plastic packaging will really appreciate. So I hope you guys enjoyed this review. I hope you guys found it helpful, useful, and informative. I hope it helps you purchase watercolors with confidence. That's definitely one of my major goals. So here is the color mixing grid, and you guys can see we had a lot of transference of color. We had a lot of color movement. It was very difficult to glaze these watercolors. So for me, that makes them not really a great fit for how I watercolor. But like I said earlier, if you love these paints, if you use these paints, let me know down in the comments. Link your art. Show me what I'm missing out on. Show me where I'm wrong. So I hope you guys found this review to be helpful, useful, and informative. And I hope you guys are looking forward to my next art supply review. I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Bye, guys.